I saw the lover's message to my wife inviting her to a party I didn't even know she was going to, with a time and address she had never mentioned. That burned into my retina as if I had witnessed the touch between the two with my own eyes, as if I were there, invisible, watching his fingers touch her skin with the intimacy that should have been mine. It wasn't just a message. It was a sentence, a cruel confirmation of everything that my intuition had been screaming for weeks, but that I refused to listen to for fear of what I would discover if I listened. I didn't hesitate. I went. I didn't text, I didn't confront, I didn't beg. I just put on my best mask of serenity, as if I were also going to that party, as if everything was under control, when inside I was already in ruins, with my soul torn apart, trying to understand at what moment in our history love became a stage for lies. I remember the loud music, the pulsing lights, the fake happiness that hung in the air, contrasting with my heart in ruins. And then I saw them. First she, as tidy as she hadn't been in a long time for me, with a sparkle in her eyes that I no longer saw when she looked at me, but which now overflowed when I looked at him. And then he, that man, a confident smile like someone who thinks he's winning a trophy, as if he'd won some secret competition. They laughed. He touched her waist with the ease of someone who isn't afraid of being caught, because he already believes he won. She looked around quickly and with relief, as if she was really sure I would never appear there. And it was then that our eyes met. Her smile died the moment she saw me. His turned into a tense mask. Time froze. And in that silence that only those who have been betrayed know, when even the party music seems to stop to listen to their pain, I was overcome by something new. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness. It was conviction. I caught everyone's attention at the party with a toast, a simple gesture that attracted curious looks. The hall stopped. Every head turned to me, including theirs. But there was no screaming. There was no scandal. Just words chosen with surgical precision. Because that night would be mine. And not to take brutal revenge, but to give them the bitterest taste, public shame wrapped in class. They thought they were in control. Little did they know that the game had already ended days before, and I was the only one who knew about it. It wasn't at that party that the betrayal began. It was built in silences, in empty apologies, in touches that became less frequent, in postponed promises, in looks that avoided mine, in absences that seemed harmless but hid the true presence, his. The betrayal began the moment she allowed another man to know what should have been ours alone. But what they didn't know was that, while she threw herself into his arms, I was arranging each piece on the board. The paperwork was already ready, the lawyers had already been instructed, the sharing had been done, with a detail that she completely ignored, all the assets were in my name. I loved her. With the intensity of someone who built an entire world around one person. I did my best, even when she was no longer giving anything. I blinded myself by love, I tolerated the lack of interest, the phone calls that ended abruptly, the new clothes without occasion, the smiles at the cell phone. But everything has a limit. And when I understood that I was no longer part of her world, I decided to leave it with dignity. I wanted to make that moment not just the revelation of a betrayal, but a turning point. Not just for me, but for everyone who once felt small when they were betrayed. Because there is something powerful about taking control of your pain and turning it into a spectacle, not to humiliate, but to liberate. In that moment when I finished my toast and made the unexpected announcement, the crowd fell silent. The two didn't know whether to run, whether to lower their heads or whether to pretend it wasn't up to them. She tried to smile, trying to understand if it was just an outburst, if I was bluffing. He was holding his glass so tightly that he almost broke it, sweating, like a cornered rat. And me? I smiled. Because there is no greater revenge than returning to betrayal the same coldness with which it was built. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare them for what would come after that toast. From then on, the masks began to fall. Friends who thought they knew everything began to connect the dots. Disconcerted family members. Judgmental looks piling up. And they, the protagonists of the farce, tried to maintain a stance that could not resist the avalanche of truths. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Each word was calculated like a piece in an emotional chess game. And the checkmate was already given before the party even started. But the most unexpected thing was not their reaction. That's what came later. Because destiny, that invisible screenwriter, had bigger plans for me. The party, which was supposed to be the scene of my emotional destruction, became the stage of my rebirth. While she faced the disapproving looks and he sweated trying to justify himself, someone looked at me from afar. Someone who saw more than one man betrayed, saw a whole man, who even though he was torn apart, chose the truth over humiliation. And that's when everything changes. Because the real twist in this story is not just the betrayal, but how I refuse to be a victim of it. Because if there's anything this story taught me, it's that sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. Sometimes, the biggest victory is getting out of a relationship that ended a long time ago, even if only you hadn't realized it yet. But there is something they still don't know. Something I also didn't reveal that night. A silent, subtle detail, but capable of completely changing the course of everything. Something that will make this story take an even more surprising turn than anyone could imagine. And that revelation is yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never romanticize or support any form of betrayal. All stories told are fictitious, but inspired by situations real that show how much infidelity can destroy lives, homes and hearts. Our purpose is clear: to expose the consequences of betrayal and provoke deep reflection on the value of truth and loyalty. Get ready. You're about to hear a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. Daniel and Laura met at a design and architecture conference in Lisbon, but they could have bumped into each other anywhere in the world, and they would still have chosen each other. There was something magnetic in the way their eyes met, as if each recognized a part in the other that had always been missing. He, a software engineer with an artist's soul, loved logical structures, but was enchanted by everything that defied reason. She, an award-winning architect, had in her eyes the depth of someone who learned to observe the world in detail, and in her smile, the freshness of someone who still believed in happy endings. They started talking about sustainable urbanism trends and ended the night laughing at jokes about projects that never got off the ground. Two different but complementary worlds. Laura brought color to Daniel's methodical thinking, and he offered stability to her creative whirlwind. Within a few months, they were sharing a spacious apartment full of natural light, designed by herself, in the heart of a vibrant city. It was the beginning of a life together built with affection, respect and grandiose plans. The first years of marriage were like a prolonged extension of the infatuation phase. Everything seemed to revolve around them. Friends considered them the ideal couple, their families were proud of their partnership, and their work only grew. Laura had some of her projects published in specialized magazines, while Daniel was promoted to Director of Innovation at one of the largest technology companies in the country. They were recognized, admired, and more than that, they felt that they were building something solid, not just a career, but a history together. Trips to the countryside on weekends became a tradition. Laura loved looking for antiques in small towns, and Daniel, with his taste for photography, recorded everything in images that later became decorative paintings in the house. The two had a little ritual every Friday: red wine, homemade pasta, and old movies. The living room sofa became a witness to long kisses, whispered confidences and comfortable silences. It wasn't noisy love, but there was presence, dedication and care. And, most importantly, trust. With time, challenges also came. Daniel started working longer hours, taking on projects with a global impact. He found himself increasingly involved in late-night calls, international travel and pressing deadlines. Laura, in turn, opened her own studio, an old dream that demanded an almost visceral dedication from her. The house remained welcoming, but meetings became rarer. Friday dinners didn't always happen, and when they did, it was with one of them too exhausted to talk. Still, there was no visible crisis. No shouting, no complaining. It was as if they had both entered a silent bubble where everything seemed functional, but there was no longer the sparkle of the early years. Laura started sleeping a little later, working on models or updating her portfolio, while Daniel locked himself in the office to analyze reports or resolve last-minute bugs. Small gestures of affection continued, a coffee left on the table, a message during the day, but it was as if love was being administered, and no longer experienced. Despite the gradual distancing, Daniel did not consider himself unhappy. He was a man of solid principles, someone who valued stability and saw in marriage not just passion, but a lifelong partnership. There was pride in the way he spoke about Laura to his friends, in the sparkle in his eyes when he showed photos of her smiling in front of the works he created. Deep down, he believed they were going through a difficult time, like so many couples he knew. I imagined that, over time, the two would find their balance again, that they would soon have time just for themselves, perhaps on a trip for two that they had been putting off for months. Laura, behind her professional success and always confident posture, gradually felt invisible. External recognition did not fill the absence of spontaneous gestures, the kisses on the neck when waking up, the hands clasped for no reason. She was beginning to wonder if she was still seen as a woman, or just as a functional extension of a well-organized life. She never told Daniel that. Not out of fear, but because I didn't know how to put into words the emptiness that grew in silence. Friends noticed subtle changes, but none of them dared to ask. The couple was still seen as an example of success, and few would realize that, behind the harmonious facade, there was a growing distance. Daniel, always kind, had become more reserved. Laura, always outgoing, began to avoid social gatherings. I preferred to stay in the studio, listening to music and working late. The physical contact between them was limited to kisses good morning and good night, and even that was sometimes forgotten. When they spoke, they did so about practical matters, bills, appointments, renovations to the apartment. There were no fights, which made everything even more confusing. The absence of conflict gave the false impression that everything was going well, but the truth is that they were losing each other little by little, like two bodies adrift, not knowing how to get back to dry land. In the midst of this silently exhausting routine, Daniel received an invitation to give a lecture in another country. It would be a week away from home, away from everything. He was hesitant to accept, afraid of leaving Laura alone, but she encouraged him enthusiastically. I said that he needed that he deserved that recognition, and that everything would be fine. For the first time in a long time, the two hugged each other tightly as they said goodbye. Daniel embarked with a tightness in his chest and a thread of hope. Maybe, he thought, this time apart would help them miss each other. Maybe that was the push they needed to find what they had lost. While he traveled, Laura immersed herself in studio commitments. It was his way of dealing with loneliness, filling every empty space with tasks, deadlines, meetings. But at night, when silence took over the house, she would stare at the bedroom ceiling and wonder if they were really living or just maintaining something that had already ended and that no one had the courage to admit. Daniel, in turn, called every night, even for a few minutes. Sometimes just to hear her voice and say goodnight. Even from a distance, he tried to show that he still cared. But short phone calls didn't resolve the deeper gaps. On the day of his return, he arrived earlier than planned. I wanted to surprise her, like old times. I imagined the reunion as a chance to start over, maybe prepare dinner, put on some music, talk about something that didn't involve work. He was determined to rekindle the flame, to look into her eyes with the same intensity as before. But I didn't know that in that interval, while he was making reconstruction plans, other choices were being made, silent and definitive. That night was still far from revealing its true colors. For now, everything was expectation, hope, the desire that it was still possible to save a marriage that seemed only dormant. Daniel walked the streets with a slight anxiety in his chest, without imagining that the steps that would take him back home would also take him directly to the epicenter of a truth that would change everything. Daniel returned from the trip a day earlier than expected. He took the night flight, slept poorly between one connection and the next, but the idea of surprising Laura kept him awake. I wanted to see her before the week started again. I dreamed of spending Sunday together, maybe having that long breakfast with pancakes and fruit, like at the beginning of their marriage. He arrived at the apartment carrying a light suitcase and a heart heavy with tiredness. The light in the room was off, but soft music was coming from the hallway, and for a moment, he thought she was already asleep. He dropped the key on the entrance table and continued in silence, but before he even opened the bedroom door, he heard muffled voices. His name was not mentioned. But there was laughter. 2 laughs. A feminine, unmistakable one. Another, male. Strange, intimate, out of place in that environment that had always been theirs. Daniel did not enter immediately. His first impulse was to retreat. He thought of 1,000 reasons to justify that, maybe a friend, maybe someone from the studio asking for help, maybe a hearing error caused by fatigue. But it wasn't. He knew. Something in his body had already felt it before his mind could even accept it. He left the apartment silently, without being seen. He went out into the street and stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, observing the building as if he could understand what was going on inside just by the way the light leaked through the windows. He didn't cry. He wasn't angry either. He felt a cold emptiness inside, as if he had been ripped from a safe place and thrown into hostile territory. He walked a few blocks, entered a 24-hour cafe and sat there, staring at the cup for too long. I tried to understand at what point exactly things started to slip through my fingers. I tried to remember the last real touch, the last kiss that hadn't been automatic. When he returned home, the living room light was on, the music had stopped, and the bedroom door was closed. Laura was already asleep. Alone. Or pretended. He didn't ask. He just lay down on the couch, closed his eyes and tried, in vain, to erase from his mind the sound of his laughter echoing through the house he helped build. In the following days, Daniel did not change his routine, but his gestures became more economical. I watched everything. Laura's every word, every movement, every expression began to be analyzed with almost scientific attention. There was no confession, but there was silence. A denser silence, an excessive care in her gestures, as if trying to avoid any friction, any inattention. She seemed more present, asked more questions, prepared meals, and even proposed a trip for the following month, as if she wanted to anticipate a new beginning that he no longer saw as possible. Daniel, on the other hand, withdrew. He kept his suspicions to himself, but he could no longer lie down next to her without feeling like he was sharing the bed with a stranger. Everything that was once familiar now seemed like a carefully staged theater set. Laura, in turn, lived between guilt and denial. She tried to justify her own actions with internal arguments that sounded empty even to herself. They said it was a phase, that she needed to feel alive, that it wasn't betrayal, it was just a distraction. That Daniel, always so distant, wouldn't notice. But I understood. And that was the problem. She knew something in him had changed. His presence was colder, his eyes were harder, and his silence was like a knife that cut without needing a word. I tried to compensate with affection, but nothing was enough. Every time she touched him, she felt like she was touching someone who no longer belonged to her. And that haunted her. Because, despite everything, there was still love. Confused, sick, but love. Time passed, and an unexpected invitation arrived in Daniel's email inbox. A large architecture and technology company was hosting a private party to celebrate the merger of their creative areas. Many important names would be there. He was hesitant to go, but ended up accepting out of professional courtesy. Then, 2 nights before the event, when using the home computer to check a document, a browser pop-up showed a preview of recent messages. Laura's networks were logged in. The most recent message caught your attention. The sender's name was unfamiliar. The content, however, was clear. An invitation to the same party. The message was straightforward, but the tone carried an implicit intimacy. I can't wait to see you there, beautiful. That last night still lingers in my skin. Daniel felt his stomach turn. His first impulse was to confront, but he restrained himself. There was something bigger there. Something that needed to be understood calmly. That night, Daniel went for a run, as he often did when something was bothering him. It ran longer than usual. I tried to find some of the control on the streets that I felt I had lost at home. He thought about the years he shared with Laura, the trust he gave without reservation, the moments when they swore to be by each other's side in any circumstance. I thought about what changed. And he wondered if, at some point, he too had failed. When he returned, Laura was in the shower. Her towel thrown on the bed, her cell phone charging next to her, the house smelling of lavender. Everything so familiar. So fake. He entered the room as if nothing had happened, kissed her wet forehead, said he would leave early the next day, and locked himself in the study. He spent hours looking at the computer screen without doing anything. For the first time, he wished he didn't love anymore. It would be easier. The day before the party, Daniel prepared calmly. He put on his best suit, perfumed himself like he hadn't done in a long time and went down the stairs with the confidence of someone who had already lost everything, and therefore feared nothing anymore. Laura, on the other hand, was euphoric. She spent the day out, came back with bags from a high-end store, and chose a tight red dress that she would barely wear to a formal event. He watched in silence. He knew she wasn't dressing it for him. And still, she said she looked beautiful. Because it was. And because she didn't know yet, he already knew. They left in separate cars, under the excuse of separate commitments. Laura said she would meet some of her colleagues from the studio before going. Daniel said he would stop by the company. It was a lie from both of them. At the party, the atmosphere was elegant, modern, full of well-known figures. Soft lights, well-chosen music, discreet waiters. Daniel arrived early. He greeted some familiar faces, grabbed a glass of wine and positioned himself at a strategic point, where he could observe the entrance. When she arrived, her heart skipped a beat. Not for love, but for confirmation. She entered smiling, confident, accompanied by a man he didn't know. Tall, well-dressed, touch her back like someone who knows every detail. They were too comfortable. Laura looked around with an expression of lightness that he hadn't seen in a long time. Daniel watched them for long minutes. He saw subtle touches, prolonged looks, heard muffled laughter. And he understood. There was no doubt. There was no more guesswork. He walked towards them without haste. When Laura saw him, she froze. The man next to him took a few seconds to recognize him, but when he did, he also turned pale. Daniel kept his smile, as if this were just a pleasant coincidence. He made a brief toast, congratulated the organizers and attracted everyone's attention. He held the microphone firmly and, in a calm voice, began to talk about trust, about partnerships, about the value of transparency in relationships. He spoke looking directly at Laura. People laughed, toasted, without understanding that they were watching the first scene of a painfully real show. She couldn't look away. He then thanked everyone and said goodbye, leaving behind the disconcerting silence that took over the group around him. But before leaving, he left an envelope on the table where the two were. In it, the divorce documents. Already signed. And along with it, a note. Every choice has a price. Now you are free to live yours. The man next to Laura didn't know what to say. Neither does she. At that moment, everything fell apart without a sound. What was left of pride dissolved into embarrassment. And Daniel, outside, took a deep breath for the first time in months. What he didn't expect, however, was to discover that this was just the surface of what was to come. Because behind the betrayal, there was still something bigger. Something hidden, carefully camouflaged in details. A secret that would transform everything irreversibly. Laura spent the days following the party in a daze. The envelope left by Daniel had become a constant presence on the living room table, like a reminder of everything he had lost without realizing how much it still mattered to him. She didn't call. He didn't respond. She didn't seek immediate explanations, perhaps because she didn't know what to say, perhaps because she expected him to come back and say there was still time. But he didn't come back. And the longer the silence stretched, the more the pain turned into panic. That relationship, as damaged as it was the foundation of his life, and only now did he realize how much he had neglected it. He tried to follow the studio routine, but everything felt out of place. The projects that once excited her now seemed cold, distant, useless. The cell phone was still silent. Silent social networks. His absence was glaring. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't look for Laura because he knew that any word spoken ahead of time would be useless. But I also couldn't carry on normally. I spent hours in silence, mentally going over every detail of the last few months, not like someone looking for explanations, but like someone rewatching a film who already knows the ending. He didn't allow himself hate. He took no pleasure in knowing that she was suffering. There was just a deep desire for justice, for closure. And, above all, liberation. The divorce was already being processed, the lawyer took care of everything, but there was something that Daniel had not yet told. Something I had been saving for weeks before the party. Something that transformed everything. Laura's lover was called Bruno. A common name, an irrelevant face, a presence that would have no meaning for Daniel if it weren't for one detail. Bruno worked at a digital marketing company that had been purchased by one of the groups that Daniel advised. During the acquisition process, Daniel had access to a series of internal reports and administrative records. In one of them, he saw Bruno's name associated with irregular financial transactions. Small deviations, nothing that would draw immediate attention, but enough to compromise its integrity. Daniel didn't mention it to anyone, but he kept the name, the history, the prints. When he began to suspect the relationship between him and Laura, he connected the dots in silence. And the week of the party, with the divorce already prepared, he had a conversation with the group's counsel. Nothing emotional. Just data, facts, numbers. Bruno was fired the day after the party. And not only that, the internal complaint, now registered, prevented him from being rehired in the sector. In less than 48 hours, he lost his job, his prestige and his open doors. But that was still not enough. What Laura didn't yet know, and what would be revealed on a quiet Monday morning, was that the apartment where they lived, the car she drove, and the studio she opened with so much expectation, were all in Daniel's name. Even the investment contracts used to structure her business were guaranteed by him, as a way of boosting the dream of the woman he loved. When the divorce was filed, he didn't block anything, he didn't confiscate anything, he didn't make threats. He just removed his name from the commitments. Without his guarantee, investors backed away. The contracts collapsed. Suppliers suspended deliveries. The studio began to quietly fall apart, just as the marriage had fallen apart. And when Laura, confused, went to the accountant to understand what was happening, she received a dry answer: the guarantees were withdrawn, the capital became unstable, and the pending payments were frozen. She didn't understand right away. He went home, called Daniel, and this time he answered. His voice, on the other end of the line, was firm. No anger, no resentment. Just firm. She started saying that she needed to understand, that things were happening too fast, that something was wrong with the studio's accounts, with the agreements. Daniel listened to everything in silence, until she, not knowing what else to say, asked if he was behind it. And then he spoke. I said yes. That the studio existed because of him. That the guarantees were his. That the financiers only trusted because he, with his name and reputation, paved the way. He said he hadn't done it out of harm, but because he believed in her dreams. And now, after everything, it no longer made sense to maintain ties. Laura tried to justify it, tried to say that the studio was the only foundation left, that it was trying to rebuild itself. But Daniel didn't give in. He said that the time for reconciliation had passed, that he needed to protect himself, to withdraw completely. But Laura insisted, this time with a lower, more human tone. He asked if they could talk, in person, like adults. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds, and then accepted. They scheduled it for that same night. When she arrived at the restaurant he chose, a discreet and silent place, Daniel was already waiting for her. She sat in front of him as if carrying a world in ruins on her shoulders. The simple dress, the hair tied up effortlessly, the eyes marked by sleepless nights. There was no makeup that could hide the sadness. And Daniel, seeing her like that, felt something he didn't expect. It wasn't a pity. It wasn't desire. It was a peaceful pain, of someone who no longer belonged to that story. She began to speak bluntly. He said he made a mistake. Who looked outside for what he should have fixed inside. That she felt alone, neglected, forgotten, but that didn't justify betraying everything they built. That the betrayal started long before Bruno, when she stopped fighting for her marriage. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted to apologize. That he knew he was paying a high price, and that he would accept everything except contempt. Daniel listened to her in silence, and then said that he had already forgiven her. Not for her, but for himself. Because holding a grudge would be the same as continuing to be attached to something that no longer existed. He said that her betrayal hurt like nothing else in his life, but that he now felt peace. And that peace was non-negotiable. Laura then, through tears, asked if he still loved her. Daniel took a while to respond. He looked at the glass in front of him, took a deep breath, and said yes. But that love, alone, no longer sustained anything. That his love now turned to himself, to rebuilding himself, to the freedom he had rediscovered after leaving that cycle. And before she could say anything, he handed her an envelope. Inside, a sales contract for the studio. He had negotiated with a group of young architects who admired Laura's work and wanted to keep the studio's name, but with new management. They would take over the debts, the structure, and give her an honorable exit. The contract was ready to be signed. She could accept and leave everything behind with dignity, or insist on bankruptcy, which would come anyway. She couldn't believe it. He asked why he would do that. And Daniel responded with a calm look, because he wanted her to start over. But away from him. That night, she returned home with the contract in her hands and her heart broken. There was no longer anything to hide, what to postpone, what to put on makeup. Daniel had ended the cycle with an elegance that hurt more than any scream. And when she opened her laptop to reread the contract, she saw that there was a photo attached. A screenshot. It was Bruno's message. The same one Daniel had seen days before. The phrase marked in red, "That last night is still on my skin." And next to it, her response. A simple one, "You made me forget about the world." Laura covered her mouth with her hands and collapsed. On the other side of the city, Daniel walked hand in hand with someone he met days after the party. Someone who arrived slowly, without promising anything, but brought back the light laughter and sincere looks. For the first time in a long time, he no longer thought about the past. And even though he wasn't sure about the future, he felt whole. Laura and Daniel's story was over. But a new one was just beginning. Laura didn't sign the contract that night. He spent days with the envelope closed on the glass table in the apartment, where they used to have lunch on Sundays. Daniel's absence still filled every inch of that space. The kettle sitting in the corner, the books that he piled on the arm of the sofa, the shirt that was left forgotten on the office chair. Everything reminded us that there was a story there, now extinct. She got up every day with the intention of moving forward, but each step was like moving through quicksand. She knew she had lost, she knew she had crossed the invisible line that separates error from unforgivability, but there was still something inside her that she didn't want to accept. Daniel's silence was the cruelest condemnation. And the way he handled everything, without shouting, without destroying, just putting an end to it, was even more devastating. In the absence of scandal, only the echo of reality remained. Life was in ruins and she had no one to blame but herself. Days later, he decided to leave the city for a while. He got in the car and went to his parents' country house, a place he used to visit on vacation as a teenager. The place was empty, like her. He stayed there for a week, hung up the phone, wrote letters he would never send, cried over everything he had held on to out of pride. She felt the weight of every choice she made, especially the ones she thought were small. The first coffee you refused, the first hug you avoided, the first night you slept on your back. He understood that the betrayal didn't start with Bruno, but the day she stopped trying to love. The day she began to confuse habit with disinterest, routine with absence. On the last day there, he took the contract and read it, line by line. The proposal was more generous than it deserved. Signed. Not out of resignation, but because I no longer wanted to carry anything that had come from Daniel. I needed to start over. But before that, there was one last thing to be done. Laura asked to meet him. Not for reconciliation, but to personally return the signed contract. They met in a discreet park, where the two used to walk on autumn afternoons. Daniel was already sitting on the wooden bench when she arrived. It was different. The fuller beard, the more serene look, a look of someone who had found some form of peace. She walked to him in silence, handed him the envelope and stood there, not knowing whether to sit down or leave. He tapped the bench, indicating space next to it. She accepted. They spent a few minutes just watching the leaves fall from the trees, the sound of children playing in the distance, the cold wind that already announced the end of summer. Then Laura spoke. He said he wasn't there to ask for anything, not even forgiveness. That they no longer expected to return, nor recover what they lost. But I wanted to thank you. Because despite the pain, Daniel had spared her the worst, the public humiliation, the scandal, the despair. She said he had handled everything with a dignity she didn't deserve, and that it had taught her more than any punishment could have done. Daniel listened attentively, but without interrupting. When she finished, he took a deep breath and replied that it wasn't about merit. That he did what he needed to do to survive it all. That he wasn't strong, nor noble, he just chose the quietest pain. He said that if revenge was the way, he would have lost himself too. And that she needed to know that, despite everything, he wanted her to be happy. Laura started to cry, but in a restrained way, like someone who had already cried everything. And then asked if he was with anyone. The question hung in the air for a few seconds before he answered yes. That I had met someone unexpectedly. It wasn't a great love yet, but it was light. That for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could be seen as a man, and not as a shadow of his former self. Laura smiled sadly and said she hoped it was true. That he deserved this. He thanked her and held her hand for a moment, without intention, just out of memory. After that meeting, Laura disappeared for a while. She moved to another neighborhood, started over in a small office shared with other architects, stopped going to the same places, deleted social media, bought a new cell phone. I wanted to disappear from Daniel's life completely. Not out of shame, but because he finally understood that there would only be peace when both could continue without any traces. Daniel continued with his new relationship, built with slowness, respect and space. The woman he met, Helena, was simple, with light speech and eyes that knew how to listen. He didn't ask too many questions, he didn't invade, he just was there. And that was what touched him most. The absence of demands, the comfortable silence, the genuine interest in listening to you without wanting to fix anything. She met the Daniel of the present, not the reflection of the past. And because of that, he also started seeing himself again. Months passed, and on a gray winter afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected message. It was from an unknown number. The text simply said, "We need to talk. It's important. About what you don't know yet." Signed, Bruno. At first, Daniel ignored it. He thought it was another attempt at justification or riot. But when he received a second message, with a screenshot of an email and an attachment with the title, "Confidential Transactions," his curiosity overcame his indifference. He arranged a meeting at a remote cafe, where no one would see them. Bruno arrived late, visibly dejected. He no longer had the same shine, nor the confident air. He had lost weight, his eyes were sunken, his clothes were disheveled. Daniel showed no sympathy. Just listened. And what he heard left him motionless for long seconds. Bruno started by saying that he wasn't there to defend himself, that he had already lost everything and he knew it. But there was something he couldn't carry alone. He said that his approach to Laura was no coincidence. That it all started as part of a dirty game between rival companies. That he was instructed, by a former director of competitive intelligence, to approach influential people in Daniel's circle. That Laura was a target, like others. In the beginning, it was just a way to obtain privileged information, understand the behind-the-scenes of the projects that Daniel advised. But over time, he got involved. He really got involved. And then he lost control. He said he tried to break up, but Laura was emotionally unstable. That when she fell into the relationship for good, he no longer knew how to get out. He tried, but it was too late. And now, seeing everything fall apart, I needed to clear at least part of my conscience. Daniel was silent for a few seconds that felt like hours. He asked if Laura knew. Bruno denied it. She said she was used, that she never knew anything, that she believed she was just experiencing something new, an escape. Daniel got up and left. He didn't respond. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He left with his heart crushed by a different pain. The pain of knowing that no matter how wrong Laura was, she was also a victim. Used. Manipulated. And that all that suffering was part of a petty game she didn't even know she was playing. On the way back, Daniel didn't go home. He went to his old apartment. He stopped in front of the building where he lived with Laura and stayed there, inside the car, looking at the unlit windows. Called her. The voice on the other end answered without haste, with a hello that carried the peace she had been trying to build. He asked to see her. She hesitated, but accepted. It was scored in the same park as before. When he arrived, Laura was sitting on the same bench. When she saw him, she felt that something was different. Daniel didn't have the calm look he had before. There was something dark, tired. He sat down and got straight to the point. He told what Bruno said. The messages. The transactions. Involvement in corporate espionage. And, above all, the fact that it was used without knowing it. Laura listened in silence. And when he finished, the only thing she could say was a whisper, "I was just a distraction." Daniel confirmed. But he also said that, when he saw Bruno's condition, he believed that at some point he really felt something. And that she, without even knowing it, let herself be carried away because she wanted to feel something too. Laura didn't cry. He just lowered his head. He said it didn't change anything. That she still cheated. Even though she was deceived, she chose to cross the line. Daniel didn't respond. He just stood there, next to her, watching the lake. And then he said that now he could continue. Because now, finally, I understood that there wasn't just one villain. That they were all too hurt to know what was right. And that perhaps, in the end, the greatest betrayal would have been to have let love die before trying to save it. And then, the two got up, walked together to the exit of the park and, for the last time, said goodbye. Not with spite. Not with regret. But with the certainty that that story was over. Completely. And forever. The days that followed the last conversation between Daniel and Laura were marked by a dense silence, as if the world had momentarily lost its rhythm and they were suspended in a kind of emotional limbo where nothing was fully concluded, but there was also no room for new beginnings. Daniel returned to his routine, to his commitments, to his projects and to Helena's company, which was gradually occupying a larger space in his life, but something within him remained out of place. There was no regret for the choices made, nor anger for what he had been through, but the final revelation about the true nature of Bruno and Laura's involvement had reopened a wound that he thought had already healed. Now it was no longer the pain of the betrayal itself that consumed him, but the complexity of the context. Laura, despite being guilty, had also been deceived, manipulated, thrown into a corporate conflict that she would never fully understand, and this duality made everything more confusing. He found himself replaying moments from the past not with nostalgia, but with strangeness, as if he were looking at scenes from a life that no longer belonged to him. He remembered the mornings when she woke up before him to prepare coffee and left notes on the refrigerator door, the nights when they shared the same pillow to whisper plans that never came to fruition, the forgotten birthdays and the hugs that disappeared with time. Now, all these images came back not as sweet memories, but as fragments of a story in which the two were victims of themselves and unspoken choices. It was impossible to ignore that behind infidelity there was a chain of accumulated mistakes, small decisions that little by little eroded the foundation of what, once, was true love. Meanwhile, Laura was also facing her own journey. He didn't communicate with Bruno again, not because he hated him, but because it no longer made sense to maintain contact with someone who, even if accidentally, had helped dismantle what was left of his life. She had moved again, this time to a smaller, simple place, where almost no one recognized her. The studio, now under new management, was struggling, but she was still credited as the project's creator. He lived modestly, accepting freelance work, small interior projects that required less emotional involvement. It was his way of starting over without having to expose himself any more than necessary. She stopped attending events, didn't answer unknown calls and even distanced herself from some friends who insisted on bringing her news about Daniel. I didn't want to know. He needed to accept that that part of his life had ended, and that the reconstruction he had to do was only internal. But something inside her still gnawed at her, guilt. Not just for cheating, but for letting love die before fighting for it. In silence, he wondered if he could have done differently. If I had said what I felt before looking for another skin, if I had cried in front of Daniel instead of smiling at a stranger, if I had understood that love also meant resisting one's own dissatisfaction. Each hypothesis hurt her in a different way, and even though she knew nothing would change the outcome, she couldn't stop the thoughts from haunting her. Repentance was not theatrical, it was not an attempt to regain what he lost, it was the simple awareness that he did not know how to value something that he now knew was rare. There were nights when I woke up with Daniel's name on my lips, and others when I just wished he was okay, even if he was far away. Helena, in turn, realized that Daniel still carried marks that she would not be able to erase. He was intelligent enough to know that he couldn't occupy a space that belonged to another story, and sensitive enough not to try to force something that wasn't yet complete. She loved him, but she loved him in a mature way, understanding the silences, accepting the moments of introspection, respecting the days when he was absent in himself. On a cold Tuesday night, while they were preparing dinner together, Helena asked if he still thought about Laura. Daniel didn't respond right away. He stirred a pan of sauce as if it were the most important task in the world. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost resigned. He said he thought so, but not with the desire to return, but with the sadness of someone who saw a dream come crashing down. He said that Laura had been an essential part of building who he was, and that forgetting that would be like erasing a part of himself. Helena just nodded and changed the subject. And in that silent gesture, Daniel understood that she was the type of woman who knew how to love without dominating. The following weeks brought a melancholy tranquility. Daniel started working more with projects aimed at human development, creating a small program within the company to help professionals deal with emotional crises linked to productivity. It was his way of turning pain into something useful. Laura began teaching drawing and architecture workshops to underprivileged young people at a community center in the neighborhood. For the first time in years, I didn't think about money or reputation. She felt that, by helping others build something, perhaps she was also rebuilding forgotten parts of herself. One afternoon, while organizing a workshop, he met a young woman called Beatrice, who asked her if it was true that she had founded the famous studio in the center. Laura hesitated for a second, but said yes. And Beatrice smiled, saying that she dreamed of studying architecture, and that the project that Laura had created had changed her life. Laura smiled back and, inside, cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. For the first time in months, he felt proud of something. And it was there that he began to wonder if, even though he had lost so much, it was still possible to leave a legacy. It was still possible to be useful, to be whole, even after so many mistakes. That thought stayed with her for days. It didn't resolve his pain, but it transformed it into movement. He stopped looking for justifications and started looking for meaning. He understood that there was no redemption for everything, but there were new paths. And even if I didn't have Daniel, I could still honor the story they lived, being someone better for others. Meanwhile, Daniel and Helena organized a short trip out of the country. It was the first time he had gone out with someone since the end of his marriage. I was nervous, not because of the trip itself, but because of the symbolism. It was like closing another door, like telling the past that there was no more room for it. At the airport, when he watched Helena calmly moving the tickets, he felt a strange peace, almost guilty. But it wasn't his fault. It was gratitude. For having survived, for having felt again, for having learned. During the trip, the two visited small towns, drank local wines, talked about everything that didn't involve work or pain. And there, in the middle of a square in a medieval village, Daniel finally laughed spontaneously. Not because he forgot, but because he finally understood that pain no longer needed to define who he was. Returning from the trip brought new decisions. Helena was transferred to a branch of the company in another city and invited him to go with her. Daniel said he needed to think. I knew the decision involved more than just changing address. It would be a definitive break with the city where it all happened. It would be leaving behind not just Laura, but the entire scenario of that life. He spent days in silence, reflecting. He looked for his old notebooks, reread forgotten texts, scribbled ideas for a new book on emotional reconstruction following emotional losses. He thought about how he could turn his experience into something that would help other people. And there, between one note and another, he realized that there was still one last thing he needed to do. He got in his car one Sunday morning and drove almost an hour to the community center where he learned Laura now worked. I didn't say I was going, I didn't send a message. It just appeared. She was leaving one of the rooms, carrying boxes of workshop materials. When he saw him, he stopped. Daniel walked up to her with a slight smile. He asked if he could help. She handed him a box without saying anything. They walked together to the small storage room, where he left the box and turned around. Laura was there, still, as if time had frozen again. Daniel said he hadn't come to reopen wounds. He just wanted to see for himself what she was doing now. He said that he had heard about the project, that he was impressed, and that he thought that, despite everything, she had found a true path. Laura smiled, this time without sadness. He said he still felt indebted to the world, but was trying to give back. He asked if she was okay. She replied yes. Not happy, not complete, but good. And that, for now, was enough. Daniel then handed her an envelope, smaller than the previous ones. She opened it. It was a copy of an article signed by him, published in a specialized magazine, with the title, Invisible Reconstructions, When Love Teaches Us Through Pain. And at the end of the text, a simple thank you, to all the people who taught me that forgiving is letting go. Especially, to someone who showed me this the hard way. Laura closed the envelope carefully and just said, thank you. He nodded and said goodbye. There was no hug, no promises. Just a last look between two people who once loved each other deeply and now understood each other without the need for words. And there, among paints, rulers and children's notebooks, the past finally found its place. There was still one last step to be taken. And he would come soon. Daniel left the community center with lighter shoulders, but not because he had found some kind of absolution, he was no longer looking for it, but because he was finally able to see his old life from a safe distance, almost like someone looking at an old book on a shelf. It no longer hurt so much to remember the dinners interrupted by tiredness, nor the silent mornings, nor the sound of the door closing behind someone who would never return the same. Now there was space to understand, and more importantly, space to allow other stories to be born, without having to compete for territory with the past. On the way back home, the cell phone rang. It was Helena. His voice on the other end was sweet as always, but with a certain weight between the lines. He said he needed to talk. It wasn't urgent, but it was important. They arranged to meet the next day, in a quiet restaurant, far from the usual places. Daniel didn't ask why. I had already learned that some conversations only reveal themselves when we are sitting face to face. The next morning, he arrived early, as usual, and watched the place go by. When Helena entered, she had an indecipherable expression on her face. She sat down, ordered a coffee, and took her time speaking. After a few minutes of silence, he took a deep breath and said that he had been thinking a lot about the future. He said that the transfer proposal had been on the table for weeks, and that refusing it would mean giving up an opportunity that might not come back. But what really worried her was the feeling that Daniel was still in transition, between what he was and what he would become. I said this carefully, without judgment. She stated that she loved him, but that she also loved herself. And that he deserved someone whole. Daniel was silent. Not because I disagreed, but because deep down I knew she was right. Helena didn't demand anything, she didn't demand a forced presence, but the simple fact that her generosity wasn't enough to fill the spaces left by the old story hurt in a deep place. He held her hands, looked into her eyes, and thanked her. Not with shallow words, but with the recognition of someone who knows the value of a woman who was sheltered, but who also knows when to leave. They said goodbye right there. No drama, no tears. Just with a long kiss on the forehead and a last hug that sealed mutual respect. Helena left a few weeks later, and Daniel remained. For the first time in a long time, there was no one. There were no promises, no shared plans. Just him and his new solitude. But this time, she was welcome. He began to explore other aspects of his own life that had been forgotten for years. He enrolled in a photography course, something he always loved, but had abandoned due to the rush of life. He began traveling alone through small nearby towns, recording places, people and stories with his lens. Each click was a way of seeing the world without rushing. He created a blog where he wrote about these experiences, but also about emotions, losses and discoveries. Little by little, his name began to circulate in lecture circles on emotional well-being and effective reconstruction. Without realizing it, he was becoming a reference in something he never planned, the art of remaking himself. Laura, in turn, continued with the project at the community center and began teaching sporadically at a local college. He avoided interviews, refused invitations to architecture events and kept his personal life far from the networks. She learned to enjoy the anonymity, the simplicity of coming home with a grocery bag and preparing a meal just for herself. On the weekends, he visited his parents, helped take care of the garden, and went back to drawing with paper and pencil, away from screens and graphics programs. I missed a lot of things, but not the life I had before. That, she understood now, was just a sketch of who she could have been. I still thought about Daniel from time to time. Not as desire, but as longing for a version of her that existed when they were together. The woman who dreamed, who believed in two bodies building one destiny. This woman was lost along the way, but Laura was committed to rediscovering her little by little. One afternoon, during a drawing workshop with teenagers, one of the students asked her why she never talked about her life. Laura smiled and pretended not to understand, but the girl insisted. I wanted to know if she was married, if she had children, if she was happy. Laura hesitated before answering. He said he had loved, that he had been wrong, and that now he was trying to learn to love himself again. The girl didn't ask any more questions. But he smiled as if he understood, and went back to scribbling his project. In that smile, Laura saw a reflection of her own journey, incomplete, but full of possibilities. A few months later, Daniel received an invitation to participate in a documentary about stories of personal overcoming. Her trajectory had caught the attention of an independent director, who wanted to portray not only her life after betrayal, but the entire process of healing and transformation. At first he refused. I found it invasive, too intimate. But as he reflected on how many people could recognize themselves in his pain and find relief in his reconstruction, he reconsidered. He accepted, but with one condition, that the narrative would not be about revenge or superficial overcoming. I wanted it to be about human complexity, about how even those who love can lose themselves, and about how starting over requires more courage than anything else. During filming, he spoke about Laura calmly, without victimism. He said their love was real, but that life requires more than love to continue. And when asked if he still loved her, he said that he loved what they were, but that today, he loved the freedom he learned to cultivate. When the documentary was released at a local festival, Laura found out about it in the press. She watched it alone at home, with her breath held and her heart racing. She saw herself portrayed through Daniel's eyes, and for the first time, she understood that she had been loved in a way she perhaps never fully understood. He cried, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. I knew I was no longer part of that present, but I felt gratitude for having been part of a story that could now inspire others. At the end of the documentary, a phrase appeared on the screen, said by Daniel in one of the interviews, "Pain makes us want to destroy, but love, even when wounded, teaches us to free." That kept echoing in her for days. The two did not speak again after that. Not because there was hurt, but because they knew that absence was the greatest gift they could give each other at that point in their lives. Daniel continued with his travels, his writings, his photographic exhibitions that now occupied small galleries in the city. Laura continued with her classes, her social projects and a peace that she had never known before. And, in a subtle way, the two continued to be present in each other's lives, not physically, but in the choices they made every day to avoid repeating the same mistakes. On a random Sunday, for no particular reason, Daniel was walking through an antiques fair and found a notebook with a worn leather cover. When leafing through, he realized it was blank. He took it home. And that same night, he sat at the table with a glass of wine and wrote the first page. It wasn't a letter to Laura, nor a personal diary. It was a record of everything I had learned. It began like this: perhaps what destroys us most is not what others do to us, but what we do to ourselves when we forget who we are. I forgot. She did too. But today, we remember. The story was not yet completely over. There was still one more moment reserved to seal it all. And when he arrived, no one would be prepared for what would come. Life is made of circles that close in silence, without applause or witnesses. Time passed with the brutal naturalness with which days follow one another after an earthquake, and little by little, all the rubble of ancient history was swept away. Not all at once, not without pain, but with the dignity of someone who, even in pieces, decided to rebuild themselves. Daniel, now with a serene countenance that is only seen in those who have faced storms without becoming part of them, was giving his last lecture of the year in a packed auditorium. The theme was emotional reconstruction through art, and among the spectators there were professionals from various areas, curious students, and also anonymous people, touched by the words he spread without pretension. In the last row, discreetly, a woman watched with teary eyes. I wasn't there by chance, but by choice. Laura sat in silence, not to confront, not to relive, but to see up close the man she once loved, lost and now learned to admire in a different way. Daniel's speech was not rehearsed. He spoke about wounds that no longer bleed, about choices that transform, about the weight and lightness of letting someone go. He told how photography taught him to see previously invisible details, how silence can be a shelter, and how forgiveness doesn't need an audience. He didn't mention names, he didn't mention dates, but every word seemed to pass through Laura with precision. At the end, when the crowd dispersed, she sat for a few minutes, taking it all in. He didn't look for him. I knew there was no more room for reunions, nor the need. When he got up, he left a small envelope with a letter on one of the chairs and left. Days later, Daniel would find the envelope when collecting the material for the lecture and, when he opened it, he would see a handwritten note, in familiar handwriting, saying simply, "Thank you for teaching me that life doesn't end when love ends. And that some losses, in the end, bring us back to ourselves. He smiled, folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of one of the notebooks he always carried with him. Laura pursued her journey with the same discretion that now defined her existence. Years later, she was invited to take on the coordination of a social project aimed at requalifying urban spaces in peripheral communities. He accepted with enthusiasm. There, among peeling walls and small hands holding colored pencils, he found the reason he had been searching for so long. He did not remarry. Not out of fear, not out of radical choice, just because he learned to love his company with an intensity that he didn't know before. On an ordinary morning, he received a letter from one of his oldest students, now a graduate in architecture. He said that Laura was the first example of a strong and vulnerable woman he met. That her story inspired her to keep going even when everything seemed to fall apart. Laura read it, smiled and cried at the same time. At that moment, she understood that the love she didn't know how to maintain in a relationship, was now multiplying through what she taught, and this was also a type of redemption. Daniel, after years of traveling, photographing and writing, released a book that would become one of the most talked about of the year, The Love That Survives the End. A compilation of chronicles, reflections and memories rewritten with delicacy and depth. The book was not about Laura, but about everything she meant in her transformation. It has become a silent success, one that passes from hand to hand with the whispered recommendation, "This has changed the way I see love." At one of the autograph sessions, a young woman approached, shaking. He said that his mother had been one of the women impacted by Laura's project, and that, thanks to her, today she dreamed of a different life. Daniel listened, moved, and at that moment he realized how much their stories were still linked, even if they would never meet again. Bruno, on the other hand, followed a more tortuous path. After being removed from his career, he tried to start over in another city, but his history weighed on each new opportunity. He tried to open his own business, but failed. He tried to return to the market as a consultant, but was ignored. In one of his last attempts to start over, he began writing anonymously on blogs about professional ethics and regret. His text circulated with a certain reach, and even without publicly assuming authorship, it became his way of dealing with guilt. He understood, belatedly, that he was not just a pawn in a dirty game, but also an agent of destruction of real lives. He never saw Laura again. I learned from a third party that she had moved on. And he never tried to look for her again. In one of his last texts, he wrote, "Some scars are reminders that we were once alive. Others are warnings that we have caused too much pain." And it ended with a sentence that seemed directed at her, "I hope that the good you build now is greater than the evil I left behind." Helena, after the transfer, became project director at an international organization focused on emotional support for refugees. In an interview, she said that her personal experience with someone who had survived a profound love loss motivated her to want to hear more stories and care for other wounds. She never married, but built a network of affection with people who crossed her path in the most unlikely places. In one of the cafes he frequented in Brussels, he once found a copy of Daniel's book on one of the tables. He picked it up, leafed through it, recognized the text, and smiled. "You didn't take it with you." He left it there, as if he knew someone else would need those words. Right there he wrote on the back cover, "For the next reader, may these pages heal you as they healed me." Everyone's paths were closed not with major turning points, but with the maturity of those who accept what they cannot change and refuse to live chained to the past. Each of them took a piece of the story they lived together and transformed it into something else: healing, creation, generosity. There was no reconciliation, there was no return. There was respect, growth, and the rarest of all, peace. Daniel, in one of his last texts, wrote that living well is not overcoming others, but overcoming yourself, especially when your own heart becomes the enemy. He said that forgiving is not forgetting, but remembering without pain. And that loving again is only possible when you learn to love silence itself. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments, if you were moved, if you identified with any character. What would you have done in their place? Take advantage and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories like this, which move the soul and make us reflect on our own choices. Remember, this channel does not support, in any way, any type of betrayal. Every story told here is fictional, and our sole purpose is to show how much our decisions matter, and how loyalty is still one of the greatest forms of love that exist. Until the next story. And don't forget, no one loses someone who was never truly theirs.